Well, hello, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Scott Stevens, the Executive Director of Communications and Engagement for the Shaker Schools. I am delighted to have with me today the opportunity to speak with Dr. Lawrence Burnley. Dr. Burnley is the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Dayton, and he is the finalist for the position of Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer here in the Shaker Schools. Dr. Burnley, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here.
The questions for this interview were submitted by the district's Equity Advisory and Action Team, which is a representative group of faculty, staff, administrators, students, and community members. So we'll get at the questions right now. Dr. Burnley, you've been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work at the University of Dayton and other institutions for much of your adult life. How might this experience inform the challenges we have here in the Shaker Schools?
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, I have. I refer to myself as an inclusive excellence practitioner. Inclusive excellence is really the kind of conceptual framework that we use in higher education to really, drive the work related to DE&I. This is really my current role is my third inaugural role. And so the niche I've kind of developed in my work is really kind of helping institutions to really build a sustainable architecture and infrastructure that will drive DE&I strategies, and to position the universities to have the kinds of capacity, and I'll talk more about that, to have impact over time, so that the work is really grounded deeply into the institutional infrastructure, and that we can think in very complex ways. Inclusive excellence really speaks to DE&I. In order to be excellent, institutions, every aspect of the institution, the life of the institution really has to be involved. And so I think the work in higher education and my experience there that I would bring to this role, should that opportunity present itself, really lends itself to helping us to have a very complex and nuanced understanding of what it really means to be inclusive. I think if I were to come into this role, I'd be very interested to talking more and more with individuals about how they understand the term equity, excellence, diversity, and inclusion. These are terms that are used pretty widely in this work these days, but I found in my experience, we understand these terms very differently. So really trying to understand how Shaker is really conceptualizing these terms, and the ways in which it's informing the work moving forward would be of great importance to me.
Dr. Burnley, I know as a graduate of Shaker, you are no stranger, obviously, to the district. Right. And I know that you're aware that for decades, Shaker has struggled with not achieving equitable educational opportunities across demographic groups of students. I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on some strategies that conceivably the district could use to advance educational equity and inclusion for all students.
For all students. I'm glad you said for all students. For certainly, we know that there are groups that are populations, demographics that are overrepresented in areas of metrics that actually measure student success, right? So we know that there are equity gaps. There are these persistent inequities that are impacting African American and other groups as well. But the work that we're doing here talks about, in my view, speaks to what excellence means for all of our students. I think, you can graduate students who are achieving at a very high level using standard metrics for student success, but yet not graduating with well-developed intercultural competencies, not graduating with the kinds of capacities that would allow a student to work effectively across multiple dimensions of human difference. I think the work that we need to do in this area speaks to the need for us to not just talk about student success, but it's really, it's administrative, the professional development and continuing education of teachers and administrators themselves. All of us are products of these systems of education, K through terminal degrees. And these systems, in my view, education in general in the United States is designed, quite frankly, and I'm gonna be candid here, to reproduce and replicate and sustain positions of power and privilege for certain groups. So let's face it. I think it's important for leaders at every level, in the classroom to the boardroom, to not only be in a position where we can identify the existence of these persistent gaps and inequities. We have to understand what historically, what policies and practices and traditions over time have informed the existence of these. Why are we? What are our assumptions that that are operating that inform how we think about why these gaps even exist? And I think we have to really have very sustained conversations and engagement at every level, to examine these complex issues, how policy and practice over time have resulted in these inequities and why they persist. So I think that's a huge part. Scott, may I refer to you as Scott?
Please.
Yeah. So Scott, I think that's the piece that I think is often missing in our diversity efforts. Sometimes we take a kind of a deficit, like we're looking at the students and those students that are, quote, underachieving by our standard measures. That's important, but if we don't get our heads around why those are happening, we're not positioning ourselves to be successful to disrupt those patterns. And I think that's very huge. The last thing I'll say is, yes, we do need to focus on those students and those populations that are underachieving by virtue of these standard metrics. Mm-hmm. But we have to see this work as being critical and important and essential for the education of all of our students. Excellence, so it causes us then, from, in my view, to step back and kind of define and redefine over and over again, what does excellence actually mean? What are the student learning outcomes that we want to see for all of our students, regardless of even, not that grades and other metrics are not important, but what does it mean to be excellence? What does it mean to model inclusion in the classroom? What does it mean to model inclusion even in terms of the core of the content of the materials that we're requiring our students to engage? I still think that we have a long way to go in terms of achieving an inclusive curriculum. In terms of the core, these books, these narratives, these sources of scholarship across multiple subjects and disciplines, the canon has not changed much over the last several decades. I look at your history and my history, and I can tell you, students we're graduating summa cum laude knows very little about the extraordinary history of African American people, indigenous populations. You can go on, but yet the standard voices and narratives that are at the center of intellectual discourse and our academic enterprise have not changed. So those voices are important, but we have to create more space that these marginalized voices and narratives are included.
And so many of us who are involved in public education have had that own experience in our own schooling, just with that limited worldview. Yeah. I think that's so true. Dr. Burnley, one of the strategies that we here in Shaker have tried in terms of trying to conquer some of these challenges has been the concept of detracking, often called leveling of courses, and with an attempt to provide equal educational opportunities for students. This is a challenge, I think, not just here but everywhere. And I'm wondering, a two-part question: what can be done to support our teachers and educators to meet the needs of all their students through detracking? And also, what do you say to teachers or parents who are concerned about detracking, that this is taking something away from my child, that we're doing this at the expense of my child?
Well, let me take on the first part of that question. I think districts really need to create the kinds of space for continuing education and professional development for teachers in order to make detracking work. And work meaning that a detract system or curriculum does not realize the fears the parents actually have that somehow detracking will diminish the quality of education and learning that their students who are operating at a higher level would undergo. And so I think, there's no real evidence. The research does not support the fears of parents when detracking is done well, that when you have more inclusive classrooms, we're not seeing that high achieving students are being penalized or suffering, or that their learning outcomes are taking a hit. We're not seeing that. But I understand the concern, right? Because and that concern needs to be addressed. Now, to effectively address it, we have to present the data, present the evidence, but we have to help teachers learn how to make those more inclusive classrooms work. We just can't say, because the teachers have been educated, both in terms of their academic preparation and their actual professional experience has been largely in tracking environments. You just can't detract and say go and live long and prosper. We have to provide the professional development and like I said, continuing education opportunity for faculty and for teachers. Now, we also, though, I believe, have to create an environment and a culture where we're not just inviting teachers to come into these spaces to learn. I think we have to expect it. In other words, we have to create incentives. We have to create policy that really ties professional development, not only around detracking, but intercultural competency, implicit bias, developing and delivering inclusive, culturally responsive pedagogy. You can go on and on and on. We have to really expect teachers to be in that space and tie that kind of learning to excellence. And I believe tying that kind of professional development and continuing education to merit, to performance evaluation and assessment, it's part of what it means to be an excellent teacher. So we have to provide the resources and, quite frankly, the organizational infrastructure, staffing, if you will, to really develop the kinds of professional development opportunities at a very high level. That can't be on the back of any one staff member to deliver that. It has to be a system-wide opportunity and an apparatus that would allow that kind of ongoing learning to occur.
I would think that the concept of cultural competency would come into that equation as well, Dr. Burnley.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I thought I referred to intercultural competency, but yes, absolutely. I mean, cultural competency, anti-racism, to understand that. We know now that there's a very intentional distortion of, for instance, critical race theory. We understand now, House Bills 322, 327. These are efforts that are really called upon to help professionals, administrators, faculty, staff, to understand the complexities of policy and practice over time that have placed us in the situation that we're in. We have to, I'll say one last thing too, with regard to this question. We have to create the capacity as administrators and as teachers to be involved in very difficult and complex conversation about these issues. These are difficult conversations. These are disrupting and very, for many, traumatic, to be able to really talk about issues around race, gender, LGBTQ identities, intersectionality. You can go on and on and on. And issues of power and privilege. Who teaches us how to have those conversations, right? These are not conversations that we're taught to have. And so building the capacity to do that, I think, is actually critical for Shaker or any other district, for that matter, to develop in order to develop, implement, and assess a comprehensive strategy to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Dr. Burnley, you mentioned, or you alluded to in your last answer, some other marginalized groups of students. Our equity policy, while much of our focus has been on Black student excellence, Black student achievement, our equity policy actually contemplates a number of marginalized groups, such as students with disabilities, other ethnic and racial minorities, LGBTQ students, and so on and so forth. And one question that came up from our group was, how can we work for educational equity for Black students without ignoring those other marginalized groups?
Well, if you're not addressing the other groups, I don't think you're effectively addressing the issues of Black students either. Inclusion means inclusion. It means that nobody's left out. Now, each group, in terms of identities and where people are located socially and economically, have unique set of circumstances and experiences, and they need attention. But at the same time, we have to have a more complex, inclusive approach to a strategy. So giving attention to one group does not unintentionally result in further marginalization or minoritization of other groups. I did note in the strategic plan here at I'm at Shaker, not my not my university.
An understandable mistake.
Yeah, but in reading our strategic plan at Shaker, there is a striking kind of racial binary occurring there, kind of white-black. And I did find myself in reading that wondering if I'm Latinx, if I'm Asian Pacific Islander, if I'm LGBTQ, or someone, a parent or student who has a different abilities or disabilities, special needs. Do I see myself in the plan? Are my realities and my challenges? And then in terms of how does the plan respond to me? And that's a concern. At the same time, I applaud, given our demographics as a district, I applaud and understand the emphasis on the Black student and African-American student experience. It needs the attention it's receiving, but we simply must not do that at the expense of other identities and relegate them to virtual invisibility. Because regardless of, for instance, as an example, Asian Pacific Islanders, Asian American and Pacific Islanders, even in this environment of COVID, we've seen an increase. Regarding them, they may be, achieving at a very high level in terms of traditional metrics for student success and academic excellence. But do we look at the data that says, oh, they're doing okay, and move on and ignore their their experience in terms of social climate and the increased tension and violence toward that community? How does the plan help us see and understand and respond to those realities as well? That's just one example, but there are others. And then, of course, there's the phenomenon of intersectionality. These are very complex issues. How does the plan address gender? How does the plan address gender identity? It's very complex, and I think moving forward, the district will be compelled, to, as it evolves in this work, to be more intentional about addressing those issues.
Yeah, I think that's right. Thank you. A lot to think about in that arena, certainly.
For sure.
You alluded, Dr. Burnley, to you used the words measuring success, I think, at one point in your answer, and I did want to touch on that a little bit. Obviously, one of the measurements we have, or at least it's thrust upon us, are state test scores and state achievement tests. I think there's a widespread view that doesn't always truly measure success for all students, or it just measures a small portion of that. I'm wondering about your thoughts on measuring what success looks like, particularly for our marginalized groups of students, and whether, how do we determine that we've been successful in creating a culture across the district that values all students, regardless of what neighborhood they live in?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Scott. I think one way is certainly how are we measuring or assessing the climate that students are expected to perform in, or teachers for that matter, or administrators. In other words, are we assessing the social climate in work environments and classroom environments, and using methods and instruments to find out, quite frankly, from the perspectives of students, faculty, teachers, staff themselves, about what they're experiencing in across multiple spaces across the district. We hear, of course, climate surveys. Those are important investments to make, because we know that climate and what one experiences socially, politically, in a climate of a classroom, and how ideological perspectives of faculty and staff may influence the climate in which a student is expected to learn. It impacts academic performance. Climate impacts work performance. Do we have the data that demonstrates how persons across multiple identities are actually experiencing? How are we? I had students today talk to me about the demographic composition of teachers. I'm not sure how accurate the data was, but they talked about the number of Black teachers at the high school 10, 20 years ago versus the number of teachers at the high school today. And it's not much movement, right? And they were asking why. Well, do we know why? As a district, why haven't we, if in fact true, why haven't we been able to recruit and retain and advance or achieve greater racial, ethnic diversity and even gender equity in the district and in the classroom? It's really our responsibility, I believe, to not recognize again. We can't dismiss that and say, well, there's no one in the pipeline, or we can't hire anybody. What do we know about the experiences of persons once they do arrive? How are we taking time to understand what the actual lived experiences have been? What training have we given supervisors or department heads to know what it means to be kind of the one and only of a particular identity in a department, and what that experience is, and then to develop strategies that are responsive to those realities that they're navigating. So I think beyond the state test, and other kinds of exams or testing that's measuring academic ability, many of those tests, by the way, are culturally biased as well, and that's a whole nother conversation. We have to come out with ways of looking at the social experience and the climate that persons are experiencing, and have really honest examination of that, and then allow that data that we establishing those baselines, and then use those baselines to have annualized, I think, scorecards, and then more comprehensive climate surveying at particular periods in time, so we can actually see how we're moving or not, and then examine the questions of why or why not we're moving those needles.
We talked a little bit about different groups of students, Dr. Burnley, and we had a question from the group on, which I think is an interesting one, that perhaps not often enough do we examine disparities in terms of gender between specifically, let's say, boys and girls. That there is some data that indicate that girls often outperform boys, or at some points are more engaged in school. Any thoughts on that? This seems to be not just a Shaker phenomenon, but perhaps a national issue.
Well, when you mention that about, what comes up for me is this phenomena of stereotype threat. When we say that one group historically, data showing outperforms another group, that data, the data is the data, but we have to get our heads around what's informing those out. Those are outcomes.
Right.
What's informing that, right? Yeah. So yeah. If you're telling me, Steele, I can't think of his first name. He's kind of one of the pioneers in this area of stereotype threat. Mm-hmm. If you're telling me, I go into a class and you're telling me as a teacher, well, the women are going to be, probably more successful. The data is showing they're more successful. That's going to have, the stereotype threat of research says that that's going to have an impact on how I'm performing as a male in that class. Just and conversely, women, you go into a chemistry class or, you're saying, well, women don't do quite as well on this test. Research says when you say that, it has an impact on the test. When you say something very different, it actually impacts the outcome of the test themselves. So we have to be careful around that. I think I keep going back to, we have to get to the why. When we see these outcomes, I think, gathering the data is important, but we cannot develop effective strategies or solutions to close these gaps unless we first step back and examine why, which is a lot of work, quite frankly, but it's work that's critical. I say to colleagues all the time, you go to an emergency room or to a doctor with a problem or an ailment, the first thing that healthcare facility will do is get a what? They want a history. They want a medical history. They need to know what's influencing possibly the condition that they're seeing in front of them. We have to not just look at the condition and develop a strategy to move forward. We cannot even develop an efficient or effective strategy unless we go back and look at the why, the history. And there's a lot of resistance, to doing that, quite frankly. It is timely. It could be costly from time or from a resource standpoint. But I think we're compelled to, those who are making a commitment to, again, closing these gaps, to achieving greater equity, we talk, at Shaker around targeted universal approach. We talk about this, excellence for all of our students. When we don't see it, we have to go back and take a look at the why. And it affects all of us, because I think there are ways in which we, based on our identities and how we're positioned socially and economically, we often unintentionally perpetuate and contributed to some of these disparities that we're seeing, because we're not stepping back and, I think, challenging and rethinking and problematizing some of the norms and assumptions that we're making, even the ways in which we've been educated. And also, we're also not listening to some of the voices and scholarship that are emerging from the communities that are being disproportionately impacted. We have scholarship, women scholars dealing, scholars from the African American community, other communities, LGBTQ communities, whose work is not being read, right? Yeah. Because they're still not central. So teacher education is a whole nother issue that we don't address here at this level. But I think we at this level, in terms of this level, K through 12, we must speak into teacher education as an example. These are systemic issues, and they're not going to happen overnight. But I think, again, as administrators and other leaders and teachers across the district, there's a level of complexity that I think begs our attention and our involvement and investment if we're really going to close these gaps in a sustainable way.
I think that's that's certainly a tremendous challenge, a lot to think about, but so very important. How we got to where we're at really is,
And Scott, I would say this as well. I applaud Shaker for the creation of the position that I'm now candidating for, the investment of the strategic planning and building infrastructure. But I think the districts like Shaker and others, we'll learn, and we are learning, that the investment of time and resources will be significant. It must be, to develop the kinds of complex infrastructures that are designed to, in a sustained way, close these gaps, to be able to understand, disrupt, and dismantle systemic issues and barriers, policies that, again, that are the culprits informing the kinds of outcomes that we're seeing. It's a major undertaking. And I think Shaker is positioning himself, quite frankly, to do the work that needs to be done. So it's an exciting time. I see with the work that Shaker's doing as being, it has implications that go way beyond impacting Shaker School District. I think it has national implications in terms of the work that's being done here.
Dr. Burnley, I will just close the interview here with a general question. I know that you've had a busy day and somewhat of a long day, and but I hope it's been gratifying and interesting for you. I just was wondering if you could share with our audience a little bit about what you saw today, what you experienced, what you are taking away from your conversations with students, faculty members, and staff. When you go home tonight, what's going to be on your mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a time for me to reflect here, right in front of the camera. It's been insightful. It has been one where I've heard lots of excitement and affirmation and hope, if you will, and even optimism about the direction of the district in addressing issues of equity, closing these persistent gaps. And at the same time, I've heard very candidly concerns with regard to what I would call opportunities for creating spaces for leaders and those in administrative roles and those that are kind of in the trenches, if you will, to be in clear communication with regard to what's in the strategic plan, what are the expectations of people, and how we're resourcing and positioning people to effectively advance the goals and objectives in that plan. I think there's some clarity that there's an opportunity to achieve greater clarity and in space for people to really hear each other. So that maybe there's a disconnect. There are students. I've met some students today. I tell you, I had to remind myself that I'm at a high school and not at a university. I mean, I was blown away by some of the questions and the kind of analytical observations these students are making about their own reality. I think students, a number of students have talked about how they're not seeing themselves in the curriculum. Largely, but not only African-American students who across different disciplines. I'm a historian by training, and I talk a lot about this persistent marginalization and even almost total exclusion in terms of the narratives and scholarship emanating from marginalized communities. They're not often present at the center of required reading, core course material that we are to engage in order to graduate. Students are not. There's a disproportionality there. There's a privilege of certain voices and perspectives that I think students have voiced today. But I think there's guarded optimism, if you will, across the district in terms of the work that's being done. I'm sitting here now because of my own, not only my history here at Shaker, the legacy of my son. He was a class of '97. But even now, by virtue of our family becoming more involved in the memorial scholarship in my son's name, I became aware of this equity initiative. And quite frankly, I'm sitting here because I'm excited and I see the commitment from senior leadership and then people I'm meeting today. There's excitement and hope and again, optimism, some guarded, but there's a lot of hope here. And so the energy is positive. The questions I'm getting are critical. It really says that people are wide awake. But I think creating the infrastructure and architecture for a sustained effort moving forward really has really no limitations to impact the kinds of to achieve the kinds of outcomes that we're looking for here.
Well, that's great. We'll end on that hopeful note. And Dr. Burnley, it's been a pleasure truly to meet you and speak with you today. And sincere thank you for sharing these thoughts with the community as well. And thank you likewise for everybody who's been tuning in to watch this. I'm sure that you found it as interesting and illuminating as I have. Just wishing everybody a safe and good weekend coming up. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir.